I would like to read a quote from a speech you gave a number of years ago. It goes, I'm not a member of a church. I am a member of a community, a family, and friends for whom I care very deeply. But I have had experiences that can only begin to be understood as mystical, that I can only describe in the language of the sacred. So taking futures and foresight out of the world of politics and society and into the transcendent or the transcendental. What are your thoughts on the existential and the meaning of life?
Aha. Well, that phrase, the meaning of life, I'm very critical of it. I don't think there is any one meaning of life. I don't think that there's a human nature. If we have any nature, it is to create culture,
Hmm.
which becomes more important than our biology. So I kind of reject these almost, I want to call them monotheistic questions that supposedly have one answer. Um, I have had, I'm not a member of a church. I've spent my life bouncing between atheism and polytheism. Uh, Polytheism, I'm going to share a quote of Nietzsche's. He said, the Greeks had the only satisfactory ever invented because the gods justified human life by living it themselves. You know, Zeus turned himself into a swan to get laid. Uh, I mean, the gods and goddesses cavorted and tricked each other, and they lived a human life. And Nietzsche then says, so it amounts to a teaching of there are many excellences, there are many gods and goddesses, there are many sacrednesses. So I've bounced between that kind of polytheism and an atheism because I just can't buy the mumbo jumbo of every religion that I've seen, and I've looked at pretty much all of them. I've really studied the world's religions. There was a time, for example, when I read the autobiography of a yogi. And for a series of weeks after I finished it, I was kind of wistful for the kind of mystical experiences that were described in that book. And then one late afternoon, I was in a small wooden sailboat out in the middle of a large lake, and the wind went dead. And I was utterly becalmed. And I swear I heard a kind of voice in my head, and I immediately knew it was my own voice as an older man. And it said to me with a sense of bemusement, didn't he know there was time? In other words, it was a mystical experience telling me I needn't be impatient about having mystical experiences.
Uh,
Great.
did you eventually have your good fare of mystical
Now,
experiences?
I hasten to add, I am that older man. And I have come to recognize a kind of divinity, a kind of sacredness, and I'll match it with my pluralism. Just because some things are sacred, it doesn't mean there's a God.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, this ties in quite nicely to what Alex is doing. Alex has recently shifted to pursuing a Masters of Meaning podcast. And in that, he talks about meaning and in general. And Alex, what about you? Of the same kind of question about, there's people have mystical experiences. How would you understand this? What kind of framework would you give it?
As I understand mystical.
Well, understand like these kind of questions, the meaning of life. Some people have mystical experiences and they then frame the meaning of life in a mystical sort of way, and some people take different paths. How would you understand these big questions?
Oh, as a balance, I think I'm close to Jay on this. It's a balance. You know, recently I was talking to a scholar about this, uh, Robert Chia, who is also a Taoist. So it's an interesting mix because he's a management scholar and he's also a Taoist. And he pointed me to a novel which I knew, I never read, but I knew, and it's Don Quixote.
Hmm.
I don't know if you guys know Don Quixote.
Yeah.
And I think it was good for him to point me to that novel because in that novel there is this basically there's this delusional man, right? Don Quixote is a completely delusional man who goes on a journey to find the knight in himself. And to him, everything around is a chivalry adventure. So he goes into a rundown inn. Oh, it's a castle that needs to be saved from the flood or something like that. So for him, there's meaning in everything. But for others, is a madman, is basically an old man gone bonkers, right? So when I realized what Robert was pointing me to, I actually had quite an awakening. I was, oh, so there is meaning, but you need to be careful that this meaning can be completely constructed in your mind. So how do you achieve that balance? Because you can fall into delusion. At some point, you need some delusion. You need some of it to convince yourself you're doing something meaningful. Otherwise, you're not going to have the perseverance. Going back to Jay's suggestion, but
Mhm.
if you go too much, if you become too young, using Taoist terms, then you exhaust yourself. Right? Too young will lead to inevitably, and then it's delusion. So you just got to maintain this balance.
That's quite an interesting way of putting it. Yeah, Don Quixote's story is, I've always thought that was fascinating, to dream the impossible dream. You know, that's I guess that's kind of what we are doing in this idea of pursuing the future. In some ways, it is impossible. It is an impossible dream that we're shooting towards. At least those of us who want a future that is pleasant and beautiful and peaceful.
It's impossible. Yeah, at the same time, you just got to do it. So
Yeah,
it's
it
in your
takes a
mind.
leap
So
of faith, like that, a little bit of that madness.
Despite, despite the fact that we cannot know what is beyond the next experiment.
Hmm, yeah.
yeah, mystery. Yeah.
So Jay, on that note, are you hopeful for the future? Looking at
Yes, I am.
nice.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Great.
I
That's great
have
to
been
be.
all my life. I had a period about 3 years ago where I got quite glum and I turned down an invitation to write an essay for a volume about positive futures. I had been asked to contribute an essay, and I said, "Oh, yeah, sure." And then I fell into a funk about the polar ice caps. That just seems to me such a one-way trip that it really got me to worrying. But I've now sort of come out of it, and I have my hopes for technology of uh, carbon extraction and sequestration. And I think either that or some version of geoengineering, I do think we have a future.
Great. Well, that's a great positive note to end on. All right. Thank you guys so much for having this discussion together, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Jay.